I am Kathleen Crowther. I am associate professor in the Department of the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine at the University of Oklahoma.
Well, thank you for joining us to talk about your book, Policing Pregnant Bodies. And it goes from Greece to Post-Roe America. And I would love for you to begin by talking about how you came to write this book and maybe one of the big things you learned in researching it.
To be honest, I started writing this book because I was angry. I was angry at seeing battles over reproductive rights that I thought had been won being refought, and angry at seeing the kind of reproductive autonomy that I had when I was in my reproductive years being denied to my children and to the next generation. At the same time, I am a historian of medicine, and one of my areas of specialty is the history of reproduction. So, I guess I was sort of trying to turn this anger into some kind of like productive, into something productive. And I became increasingly struck in kind of listening to the rhetoric surrounding the pro-life movement in particular, but also a lot of rhetoric surrounding the kind of controlling pregnant women, rhetoric surrounding kind of miscarriage, rhetoric surrounding pregnancy loss, rhetoric surrounding drug use during pregnancy, et cetera. I became struck by how deep the continuity seemed to me between things that the ancient Greeks said about women's bodies and the relationship between pregnant people and their fetuses, and what I was hearing kind of politicians in the 21st century say. So I became kind of increasingly interested in seeing these kind of very deep continuities. I will say that actually, the more that as I got into the research for the book, the more of these that I found, like the more striking that became to me, that this notion that the fetus is a separate individual being that needs not only separate from the person whose body it inhabits, but that also it needs protection from the pregnant person, that pregnant people are fundamentally hostile to, the pregnant body is a hostile environment for the fetus. That kept showing up over and over and over again, whether reading Aristotle or, medieval authors, or, as I say, kind of like modern pro-life advocates.
Well, it was an incredibly difficult book to read for exactly the reasons you just pointed out, in that as a male reading it, I was incredibly incensed by some of what was going on in the male mind as to what was going on in the female pregnant person's body. And I can't imagine having come across some of this information as a woman and finding out how this information not only originated, but originated in such ignorance and arrogance and just outright fallacy. I mean, and then these fallacies just continued to build and build and build. And I think you make a really good case for how we ended up here today based on people like Aristotle and Plato and the other Greeks and Romans. Could you talk a little bit about why you had to go that far back and what it says about this kind of Western tradition, I guess?
Yeah, I find that there's a lot of really good histories of abortion, and particularly of abortion and of birth control and kind of reproductive rights a lot of really good histories for the 19th and 20th century. I mean, some really amazing, amazing body of scholarship on that. And I found considerably less considerably less of these sort of like longer approaches. And yet it seemed to me that that the fact that some of these ideas about the female body and the pregnant body go back to antiquity really shows how kind of deeply like rooted they are. Like one of the metaphors I talk about is like the bun in the oven, right? Like why do we talk about, I mean, we recognize that phrase now. Like if I, I mean, it's a kind of cutesy way of saying someone's pregnant, but it's an idea that goes back to Hippocrates. Hippocrates used that metaphor to describe the fetus in the pregnant body. And as I see in the book, this is a metaphor that presumes the female body is purely passive, just a heat source, because you know that when you bake bread, like all the actual like real work and skill that's in preparing the dough. Once you put it in the oven, you're just waiting for the bread to rise. And so why are we still talking about, even though that's just like kind of a cute way of saying, like, why does that even resonate with us today? Like, why do we even like recognize that this metaphor that treats the female body as kind of purely passive? So it seemed to me that there, like, even in a lot of our language for talking about pregnancy, a lot of our metaphors, a lot of our ideas seem like really rooted in these older ideas that are kind of unexamined. And I thought there was a value to kind of seeing the roots of these ideas, to really kind of examining them. And I'm not saying that anyone who uses the expression "a bun in the oven" is a misogynist. Okay, generally it's not, meant in any kind of like harmful way. It's just in thinking about the kind of ideas underlying that and why that makes sense to us. I think there's a value to kind of excavating that, because I think it does help us to think more deeply and critically about like more serious things, like why it is that pregnant women are so frequently blamed when something goes wrong with the pregnancy, why we devote so much more attention to, say, maternal drug use than kind of environmental toxins that harm fetuses, right? Because we think of the sort of pregnant body as just this sort of like incubator, and as long as that incubator is working fine, the pregnancy should go fine. But that's not, that really kind of ignores whole whole domains of experience for both the pregnant person and for the fetus. But the fact that scientists devote far more attention to the kind of harms to the fetus that come from like maternal drug use or maternal stress, or something that the pregnant woman does, as opposed to kind of environmental toxins, that says something about the ways in which these older ideas continue to shape even scientific views of pregnancy and fetal development.
Well, and I think that's one of the tensions you set up in the book, which is this idea of the fetus versus the mother, and how not only is the mother a passive kind of oven, as you say in that metaphor, but it's also hostile too. And doctors are constantly, and throughout the ages, are constantly looking at the fetus and the growing baby, I guess, inside the mother, at the cost of and expense of pregnant body health and well-being.
Yes.
And
yes.
And the way you break it down in the chapters is incredibly useful, I think. And the first one you talk about is the idea of the heart. And we're in Ohio, we know all about the heartbeat bill.
That's right.
So you can kind of begin by talking about what the heart means for a pregnant person's fetus?
Yeah, so so the heart and the kind of heartbeat have had this incredible kind of like metaphoric significance as well as biological significance in Western culture. I think in different ways in other cultures as well, but just speaking of kind of Western culture, going back to the ancient Greeks, Aristotle thought that the heart was the first organ to form and that it was the primary organ in the body, not just in the sense of being first, but in the sense of being the most important and the one that signified life and the organ that kind of controlled all the other organs. And other ancient Greek and then later kind of medieval thinkers have somewhat different takes on this, but but historically the heart has been seen literally as the source of emotion and interiority and the seat of the soul. And so um, when the advocates of heartbeat laws talk about kind of fetal heartbeat, they are really drawing consciously, unconsciously on this like very long tradition that associates kind of the heart with the soul. Like the heart has a cultural significance that other organs do not have. So, so heartbeat laws, just to make clear, are laws that prohibit abortion after detection of fetal cardiac activity, because really there's not a heart present that's pumping blood at around 6 weeks, but you can detect kind of electrical impulses in cells that will eventually develop into the heart by around 6 weeks of pregnancy. In a way that's not like new, right? Like Aristotle said, ancient Greeks said, yeah, there's a heart like early on, and like that heart is the kind of that is the seat of the soul and the seat of kind of like life and vitality. And even though biologically we don't share those ideas today, culturally we still do think of the heart in those terms. So these heartbeat laws kind of draw on that old tradition, while at the same time kind of giving it kind of the veneer of science, because you can only hear a fetal heartbeat with highly advanced ultrasound technology. Like you can't use a stethoscope to hear a fetal heart, not at 6 weeks. Later on you can. So they're kind of clearly sort of like drawing on this this older set of ideas, because it's like, you could say kind of, I mean, the heart is it is a vital organ, but other organs are vital too. Like we don't like, while a heartbeat kind of signifies life, so does breath. And the fetus cannot breathe on its own until very near, very near full term. So and yet, uh, and it's also possible, of course, for someone for the heart to kind of actually keep beating even after someone has stopped breathing. So there's a kind of a use in these heartbeat laws of kind of this quasi-scientific language, but really kind of heavily drawing on these assumptions that the heart and the soul are connected. And so the heart is this symbol of the kind of like individual.
Yeah, and I was also fascinated by this idea that the heartbeat or the heart of the fetus is its voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean that's just kind of an aside, but the testimony of fetuses
Yeah.
at the Ohio hearing,
Yeah.
something else. But it speaks. We were just talking about the development of how a fetus kind of develops from conception to birth, and that's been a fraught avenue of discovery, hasn't it?
Mhm.
How have doctors traced the development of a fetus?
Um, yeah, so somewhat, I guess, ironically, our understanding of fetal development comes from abortions and miscarriages. That was for a long time, and the only way of kind of studying what, you know, the sort of stages of fetal development. And one thing that I was actually surprised at when I started getting in. One of the things that really surprised me when I was doing research for this book is how many anatomists from earlier periods studied fetuses and from either abortions, miscarriages, or the cadavers of pregnant women. I kind of knew that there was deep interest in this. I mean, maybe because, I don't know, reproduction is an intrinsically interesting subject. We all kind of want to know like where we came from. Okay, so I can, but that even like Aristotle was looking at kind of aborted and miscarried fetuses, and anatomists, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, began really kind of seeking out aborted or miscarried fetuses at all different stages, and really trying to put them in jars and kind of line them up so that they could have this sort of sequence of development. So that kind of interest in kind of tracking sort of fetal development, you know, goes back a long way. I also do think, though, I say putting them in jars, I mean, you know, by the 16th, 17th century, anatomists did have techniques for kind of preserving fetuses and other body parts, other organic specimens, preserving them in alcohol. And, you know, they really did seek out like collections that allowed them to kind of see from the tiniest stage up through actually up through kind of stillborn and even kind of like neonatal specimens. So, but I think that too has played into a tendency to kind of see the fetus as distinct from the woman who carries it, because we're used to thinking of fetal development in terms of like these fetuses that are separate, that are in jars, or, you know, that are like Leonard Nielsen's like famous photographs of like, you know, when life begins, which, you know, sort of the fetus is just floating against this dark background. So we're really accustomed to kind of seeing fetuses sort of separate from their mothers, and that you know, that does connect to this long history of studying fetal development by studying fetuses independent of the maternal body.
And it's worth mentioning too that a lot of these discoveries were made on Black and brown bodies, enslaved bodies, and people who had no agency in and of themselves. They were property, their fetuses were property, and what happened to them was at the behest of white men usually.
Yes.
And to that end, I'd love for you to tell us about the hysterectomies, because when I read this segment about how they were trying to get the earliest point of conception and where the body came, they tried to get women who were going to have hysterectomies. Well, you tell us, because it's something else.
Yeah. So this is in the 50s and 60s, and John Rock, who's the what do you call him, father of the birth control? Do you call him the father of the birth control? That's gonna be somewhat odd, but John Rock was probably the most prominent reproductive fertility specialist in the country. And he and his team started trying to collect fetuses from the very earliest stages. And you know, although like there were fetal specimens from somewhat later stages from both miscarriages and abortions, getting fetal specimen or embryonic specimens really from the first few days, hours, days after conception those are really hard to obtain because most women who have miscarriages that early won't even realize it, and those tiny cells are just expelled with kind of what seems like menstrual fluid. So what Rock did is, in order to get these specimens, is that he arranged for women who were getting hysterectomies, and these women were getting hysterectomies because they already had at least 3, maybe 4 children. I think there was a minimum requirement to be there. It was at least 3. It might have been 4. So these women were going for planned hysterectomies, and he arranged for them in the months leading up to the hysterectomy to stop using to not use any form of birth control, and to have unprotected sex with their husbands, and to record like when they had sex. And then when he did the hysterectomies, they would immediately take the uterus and search it to see if there were any embryos, and that this is how they ended up kind of collecting embryos that were, I think in the youngest case, only a few hours old. So this is how we come to know about the very earliest stages of fetal development, is through this kind of work on collecting embryos.
And again, it just goes to kind of that fetal primacy or the embryonic primacy over the, not necessarily the health, but definitely the mental health and the whatever would be going on with a woman who would be having a hysterectomy to find out later that they were pregnant. And what, that kind of thing was, again, we need to know what's going on with the fetus at the expense of the mother, correct?
Yeah. Although it also does suggest, interestingly, a kind of different, like it's hard, you can't imagine that going on today in the current kind of political context. But in fact, the women who were doing this did actually fully understand what was going on. And it's not, they don't, I mean, they agreed to it, right? And it really is hard to kind of, it speaks to kind of actually some, I mean, my book is far more about kind of continuities, but there are some important kind of like discontinuities I pick up on here and there, and that is one. I mean, in the mid 20th century when this was done, people did not have the kind of like qualms about that kind of scientific work that, say even kind of work on kind of embryonic stem cells generates today.
Well, and part of that is because of the decision of Roe v. Wade, right? And the pushback against that, and the organization of pro-life, anti-choice movement.
Yeah. And there's, been this deliberate campaign to make people kind of think about fetuses from the moment, or embryos from the moment of conception, as babies, that would make kind of that work sort of unthinkable now.
So your next chapter, and moving kind of out of this fetus is in jars. How did the womb become a dangerous place? How did the biology of baby making, I guess, become a location of conflict and danger and mystery as far as it all went?
So the earliest ideas about, at least the earliest kind of Greek ideas about pregnancy, or about kind of conception and pregnancy, were that the fetus was nourished in the body by menstrual blood. So until the early 20th century, maybe until about like the 1930s, menstrual blood was understood was not connected to the reproductive cycle in the way that we think of it today. So particularly for pre-modern thinkers, anyone before kind of 1800, the menstruation is a form of like bodily evacuation, like urination or defecation. It's not directly connected to the menstrual cycle, to reproduction, except insofar as when a woman is pregnant, she typically doesn't menstruate, they thought, because this sort of excess food that's in the body that's expelled as menstrual blood normally, that then during pregnancy, it actually goes to feed the developing fetus. So there's this, like, menstrual blood has this sort of like dual nature. It's both like an excrement and a form of nourishment. And then there's also the idea that after birth, the menstrual blood is transformed into milk, which is why, so there's an explanation for why it is that pregnant women typically don't menstruate, and lactating women typically don't menstruate. So menstrual blood has this dual character. And very early on, it is seen as both nourishing and harming the fetus. So this is an idea from, I think, the 9th century, from the Islamic world, actually. The idea that it's an Islamic, a Persian physician, I think, in the 9th century, Hali Abbas, who says that that smallpox, which was a disease of children near exclusively, that's caused by menstrual blood. That is that. So his observation was that many, maybe even most children get smallpox, and because it was an endemic disease by the 9th and 10th centuries in Europe and the Middle East. And he said the reason that they get smallpox is because it's part of maturation, and it's part of purging these menstrual poisons out of the body. So that's an explanation for an endemic disease that presumes that children are all poisoned in their mother's bodies, and part of growing up is purging these maternal poisons from the body. And that was like the dominant explanation of smallpox in Europe and the Middle East until the 19th century, or at least until the 18th century. And then it maybe shared space with some other explanations. But yeah, the idea that that this sort of that this menstrual blood is toxic and is kind of like always harming fetuses, which just seems to me kind of extraordinary that you could come up with that kind of explanation for something that kind of, that you would make kind of this maternal poison just a kind of regular feature of kind of pregnancy or maternal fetal relations. And then, so that's kind of, I think, one particularly, to me, striking example, because smallpox seems to have nothing to do with reproduction, and yet, like, for them, it does. That's what happens. It's the price of having to be gestated in a female body. But there are other ideas too about if women are overly emotional when they're pregnant, particularly if they get angry, that will cause harm to the fetus. And then there's whole big area of maternal imagination, where things that the mother sees or desires, or if she's startled, or any, things that impress themselves upon the mother's imagination will impress themselves upon the fetus. So the main explanation for any kind of congenital abnormality in a fetus or in a newborn would be maternal imagination, not well, yeah, really, that would be the kind of the main explanation. So these are ideas that presume that like the harm, all mothers harm their children to a greater or lesser degree.
Right, and this is even before the invention of psychoanalysis and the whole psychic layer that's added later of blaming the mother for all sorts of
Right.
things. But one of the other things, and the maternal imagination was incredibly striking because I guess you could make a case for like not misunderstanding physical processes without having known about them, but this idea that there's kind of a conscious decision on the role of mothers to poison their bodies based on what stimuli or what they're dealing
Mhm.
with is incredibly fraught and
Yeah.
terrible. But along with that is this idea of everyone having advice. And you mentioned in the book that like if you're pregnant, visibly pregnant, strangers will come up to you and just give
Yes.
you advice on what to do for a healthy baby. And there's been
Yes.
some, again, extending not maternal health, but fetal health, as in like eat oranges and you'll be, that you'll have a whatever. What what is the purpose of those interventions and advice and diet and all these kind of things that supposedly a woman could do to assure that her body doesn't to kind of offset what her body naturally does?
Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, yeah, all of that kind of advice, which has changed. Okay, the fact that there is all this advice hasn't changed. So the nature of the advice has sometimes changed over the years, but it all kind of presumes that yes, like mothers left to their own devices will make bad choices, so they need advice. They don't like know any better. And also uh, that the responsibility for a good outcome of what meaning like a healthy baby is entirely dependent on the woman and the choices that she makes during pregnancy. And I think particularly now, and I want to connect this to kind of contemporary concerns with our very high rate of maternal and infant mortality in the United States. Our incredible over focus on women's behavior as determining kind of whether the infant is healthy has really prevented us from seeing and addressing I would say the kind of the real causes of poor outcomes in pregnancy, which are environmental toxins and environmental concerns in environmental harms in many parts of the country. Also, the presumption that women can just like make healthy choices in their diet and exercise is just inaccurate. I mean, that's totally class-based. I live in Oklahoma, where of our 77 counties, over 2/3 have food deserts. So, for women who are kind of struggling with, who are living in poverty, they don't have the option to like eat healthy. Healthy food costs considerably more and is impossible for some pregnant women to access. And so, what we should, I think, as a society, be trying to do is make it possible for all pregnant women, well, actually all people, really, but I think it should be our responsibility as a society to see that kind of pregnant people are able to access fresh food, clean water, safe housing, all of these things, and adequate and compassionate medical care. And we really put the onus on women to have kind of healthy outcomes, and we don't, as a society, kind of take responsibility for that. And I think, again, that is because we have this very long tradition of kind of like thinking about the main harm to fetuses comes from their mothers, and if women would just behave themselves properly during pregnancy, then they would have healthy babies, and they presumably would be healthy themselves. And so we don't pay near enough attention to kind of like the real harms to fetuses and to pregnant women.
Well, and it speaks to as well this idea that eventually comes out in the anti-choice movements, of women, selfishly choosing to end a pregnancy, selfishly doing it for whatever reason, right? I want to have a career. I want to, and it's an extension of that. Women are somehow anti-fetus, anti-pregnancy, everything about them is somehow, and that's an incredible twist that we've done as a society.
Yes. Yeah.
And kind of wrapping that twist up is this idea of miscarriage, and how women are first seen as the reason for it happening, because of some of the reasons we've already discussed. But now, in our 2010s, going into the 2020s, now we are seeing criminalization of miscarriage.
Yes.
And we're seeing, especially in states where abortion is now illegal, proper care for dangerous or I guess biologically failed pregnancies, can go untreated and then punished, correct?
Yes. Yeah. 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 Particularly, I'm thinking of, see if I'm getting her name right, Brittany Watts, who, was left to miscarry, was refused medical care for a miscarriage. And then when she miscarried at home, was reported by, a nurse at the hospital she eventually got treatment at. Yeah. So this kind of blaming women for miscarriages. It is, yeah, a very kind of like worrisome trend. I mean, I think the tendency to kind of blame women for miscarriages has long been there. The kind of criminalization of it is newer. And well, is utterly kind of like counterproductive too. Like, and I guess that's another thing about some of this. If you frighten women away from seeking healthcare if they are pregnant and dealing with an addiction, for example, or if they're then you're only going to have kind of like worse birth outcomes. So if women are kind of afraid to go to the hospital because they're miscarrying, and you're only going to raise the rate of maternal mortality if you kind of create this this sort of antagonistic system between kind of healthcare providers and women. But the problem is most acute for women of color who are now kind of who already have far higher rates of maternal mortality, are already far more likely to suffer from kind of bias among medical practitioners. So they're the least likely to receive, particularly Black women, the least likely to receive kind of compassionate, high quality medical care, and the most likely to be surveilled and blamed if something goes wrong with their pregnancy.
Well, and yeah, and that point can't be driven home hard enough. I think the one of the things that when you were speaking, it reminded me, it's kind of counterintuitive that it seems like if you would ban abortion and your goal is for live birth, then female reproductive health should go up. Like that
Yeah,
care should go up, but in reality, it goes down because so many of the complications and issues, as we're talking, start to
yeah,
become problematic by the law you're writing to assure birth. Is
yeah,
that a fair statement?
yes, yeah. And I think to me, this was also part of the point of seeing these sort of like long continuities because they made greater sense of these paradoxes, that actually, of course, we have worse maternal mortality in states that have more restrictive kind of abortion laws. We have higher infant mortality in states that have uh, uh, tighter have more abortion restrictions, and that like and why should that be the case? I mean, I'm not the first to kind of like say that it is, but I think it's more than just kind of the hypocrisy of um, pro-life politicians, although it is that. It is this kind of like long-running idea that mothers and fetuses are separate, that the fetus needs protection from the mother, and so you could have this set of legislation that kind of like protects the fetus, and that would be effective at producing kind of more healthy infants. But I think the logic behind that, these old ideas are, themselves flawed. And that's why you end up with these sort of kind of blatant contradictions.
Well, and I think it also speaks to the rhetoric and narrative of the anti-choice movement, but also of the pro-choice movement. Because in some ways, the pro-choice movement buys into the same sort of uh, tradition of some of these threads that you've uncovered. And
Mhm.
how do we then counter that narrative? Where does it start to unravel this long chain, or this long thread, I guess is better, um, of anti-woman um, and pregnant people? And how do we start caring for both the fetus and the woman who's pregnant? Where where do we go from here?
I mean, for me, the most helpful and inspiring thinking comes from Black feminists like Dorothy Roberts and Loretta Ross and all of these sort of women who kind of theorized reproductive justice, thinking in terms of kind of um, working toward the right to not just to have an abortion, but the right to have a child, the right to be able to kind of raise that child in a safe, healthy environment. Um, and I will say that as somebody who teaches about reproductive rights and reproductive justice in a very red state in Oklahoma, um, I certainly have a lot of students who I think identify as pro-life. I don't usually kind of poll students, but it being Oklahoma, I think a lot of them do. But I find them like actually far more receptive to reading like Loretta Ross's work, kind of this foundational work on reproductive justice, and kind of moving beyond thinking about like, should someone be allowed to have an abortion, to uh, uh, should we be making sure that kind of like pregnant people and their children have healthy, safe environments? They're like, I think it feels to me, from having taught this stuff for many years in this particularly politically volatile state of Oklahoma, that is really the way forward. A kind of way of framing reproduction that people on who come from kind of different sides of the political spectrum can actually find common ground. For example, one of the things that I sometimes talk about in classes, kind of compulsory sterilization, particularly of kind of Black women, Native American women, which the US has a long history of. And I have to say, none of my students, whether they're pro-life or pro-choice, none of them ever think that's a good idea. Everyone is appalled and thinks that's, terrible, just terrible idea and completely immoral. And I feel like there's so much about this sort of reproductive justice framework that they can get behind, that actually and I don't know, it feels more like becomes more important to think about what we positively could do to improve our maternal and infant mortality rates, rather than kind of focusing solely on the question of whether people should or should not have abortions. I mean, that's part of it. But I also think, kind of seen within this sort of like broader picture, because I think a lot of students are used to seeing kind of abortion, and this is, often how it plays out in the kind of national media. Like, abortion is like a single issue. It's not connected to all these other parts of reproduction. This is why I think it's confusing to a lot of people when, like, reproductive rights advocates say, abortion is healthcare. You can't like remove abortion from the whole spectrum of reproductive healthcare without kind of impacting all of it.
Well,
Yeah.
and as I'll say this as a, as a kind of an aside, but I think one of the major themes that I read into your book was men need to get out of this space. We don't have a reason. Everything we've seen to contribute has been wrong, hurtful, somehow disingenuous, fearful. I mean, the words just keep coming. But I mean, it seems like, why aren't women in charge of this from beginning to end?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. Yes.
So maybe that's the answer. But anyway,
But
go ahead.
yeah, but I mean, I think men can be feminists, and have a definite kind of like, role to play in kind of advocacy. Um, but the other thing is, of course, I don't think women historically have internalized a lot of these ideas. And so, I'm just very personally, I've had two miscarriages, and both times I felt really, really guilty. And because this is there is more sort of like scholarship now on miscarriage, and people like talk about miscarriages, like become a little bit more open, but but there was this way in which I like fully bought into this, like I must have done something wrong. And I don't think I'm like, so that's just sort of a small example, but I do think that kind of uh there are a lot of like women who've internalized these ideas, and actually, even for me, one time, I think actually I had this real aha moment one time when I was having a conversation with students about Aristotle's reproductive idea. So I teach a course on like women in medicine that goes from antiquity. This, in a way, the book kind of came out of that many years of teaching that course. And I'm talking about Aristotle's theories of reproduction, about how the male contributes the soul and the female just the body. And I'm going, and the student was like trying to wrap their mind around it. And all of a sudden it struck me, this is really nuts that he thinks the male has the active role, like, because he ejaculates semen and 9 months of pregnancy is purely like, that is nuts. And yet, like, honestly, it wasn't until that moment that it really struck me how very bizarre that was. Because, I think because I sort of, I said, yeah, okay, yeah, saying that women are passive is misogynistic. Yeah. But like it hadn't like really kind of hit me at a point like that is some real mental gymnastics. Like he had to work really hard to turn this 9 months of pregnancy into just like an oven baking. So I think there is this way in which kind of even, women who've been kind of steeped in this language too, like we also kind of like internalize it. And I think we need to kind of also we also need to kind of interrogate some of these assumptions that we make without thinking about them.